doodly.
Hello and welcome to Webhack Wednesday. I'm Martin Beebe.
And I'm Martin Kern.
And today we are going to be talking about CSS Grid.
Good. What's that in?
You know how you lay out everything on websites with tables?
I love tables. I'm so stuck in the 90s, it's insane.
It's the reality of web development, and I think the most complicated part of web development
It's tables.
is layout and
Yeah,
getting layout
it is.
right.
Yeah.
And it used to be like, okay, we just fudge it and it would be fine,
Yeah.
and we get it working. But now, because there's so many different viewports,
Yeah.
you've got mobile, like responsive, and you know, in our world, you've even got working in HoloLens
Yeah.
and in all sorts of different environments.
So
where
we can go from like a 4-inch phone screen up to like an 80-inch Surface Hub type screen. It's kind of,
and you've got to develop websites for all of those, and so layout becomes a really complicated problem.
yeah.
And CSS Grid is probably the first attempt, really, at solving this long-running problem of
Yeah.
layout on the web. Because
Yeah.
if you've done grid on the web before,
Yeah.
then you end up with all sorts of crazy push-pull,
Yeah.
call span, tent. Like you end up with like Bootstrap, which have an rather elegant solution to grids, but actually it's not that sophisticated,
No.
and you can't move things around on different elements of the
No,
grid. The
yeah.
flow matters,
Yeah.
and it shouldn't really matter.
Yeah.
You should be able to place different elements in different places.
Yeah.
And CSS Grid's kind of been evolved to solve that problem.
Okay.
CSS Grid arrived. I've been working with Grid since 2012, 13.
So this is actually a standard.
It is a standard,
Yeah.
but it's been formed since then, because
Yeah.
we had the very first version of CSS Grid came out in Windows 8.
Right.
And it was largely because, if you remember back to Windows 8, we had loads of horizontal...
I love Windows 8.
We had horizontally scrolling apps.
Yeah.
And whilst that was really easy to achieve in XAML, they
Yeah.
also had this idea that they wanted to allow you to build apps in JavaScript and HTML.
Yeah.
And they wanted this way of creating horizontally scrolling apps. And if
Yeah.
you try and do that with traditional grid systems
Yeah.
in the web, it's just impossible to
Yeah.
create good horizontally scrolling apps. Now, the fact is, we actually ditched horizontally scrolling apps, but the process, the idea of having a real sort of quality layout system in CSS still stands.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we implemented that, I think it was in IE10.
Right.
That's the very first internet version which has any version of CSS Grid.
Okay.
And it was good, and it meant that you could create these kind of Windows 8 style applications and
Yeah.
layout stuff. But it did have some drawbacks. In IE10, it's vendor prefix, so it's -ms
Yeah.
grid. But subsequently, all of the browsers got together because we submitted it as a standard,
Yeah.
and then they developed it into this, what we have nowadays, which is CSS Grid
Okay.
full fat.
Right.
And it's the
Excellent.
now standard unprefixed version,
Yeah.
which is currently only in Chrome and Firefox.
Okay.
But it's likely to come into every browser. We're certainly working on it on Edge. We
Yeah.
have the old unprefixed version, or the prefix version. We're going to have the new version. So this is the vast majority of people browsing the web today are actually using Chrome. And so you actually could use this today quite comfortably. Also, it's quite an easy, as a CSS sort of thing, you can use it in combination with existing techniques for layout as well. So there's lots of examples of how you can use CSS Grid in addition to your existing layout systems to create grids. But it would be beautiful if you could just use CSS Grid for layout, because it is actually a really wonderful way of laying out stuff on the web. And I just want to give you a flavour of that
Sounds intriguing.
really.
I've never really looked at it, so this should be good.
Okay, so I'm just going to end up creating myself a little folder where we'll create some stuff. So I'll just call it Grid Demo for now.
That's a good name, by the way.
Grid Demo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always think that's good. So if you looked earlier in the series, there is a bunch of Visual Studio Code tips and tricks.
Yeah.
We did a whole episode on that.
Yeah.
So one of my favourite tips and tricks is just launching it, which is if you just type CMD inside of any item, any folder on side of Windows, you can get to the folder.
Yeah.
And then if you want to open code, you would place code dot. However, another thing which I talked about in that episode is if you put index.html, you can actually do index.css as well, and press enter. It will go create those two files for you.
That's just ridiculous, isn't it?
It's just, it's probably not.
And what is the world coming to? That is
Yeah.
The levels of productivity that we're reaching now with this technology is unfathomable.
But now I've created that little index HTML file.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is create a very basic HTML kind of layout that I can then use Grid to kind of style and do stuff with. So if I type, I just typed all that, by the way.
That was very quick.
Yeah, I just typed some basic. I'll do that later. Elements. Now I'm not even putting HTML and body in here because it's HTML5. So by default, all of that stuff just gets added by the browser if it's not present. So I've just added a H1 element, an article element with some lorem ipsum.
Very good.
And a nav element, and a side, and a footer.
Okay.
And so I've tried to keep it as clean as possible.
Yeah.
Now, this will. Anything which doesn't support Grid is just going to display this in line as it's written.
Yeah.
But with Grid, we can start customizing how we're laying out and how we're placing some of these different elements. So if I just add a style tag in line, that's all good web developers obviously do, like that. And in here, if I just put
that was quick typing
again really quick. This is almost like I've got snippets.
Yeah.
We have a tag which just represents the body.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this can be any container item, but I use body just for simplicity.
Yeah, sure.
And the key kind of element here is display grid.
Right, okay.
So you might have seen display block or display various different ways of displaying things where we say that this element or this container element is a grid.
Okay.
Okay, and then on that grid, we're going to set up some rows and some columns.
Okay.
So it's a little bit like a table, if you imagine, it's actually like a grid.
I'm starting to feel very comfortable, all of a sudden.
You should do.
Yeah.
The reason is, when you look at, if you've been a web developer for some time, we used to do lots of layout and layout tables. It's quite embarrassing to sort of think that we did, but the problem with doing table layout is that we're munging together layout and HTML when CSS should be managing the layout,
sure.
and that's. So this kind of gives you all the benefits of table layout, but all the flexibility of CSS.
Okay.
So whereby previously with a table layout in HTML, you would have, been anything you put inside of those table datas, they have to stay in that position. You can't move them about.
Yeah.
With CSS Grid, we can move these things about onto different elements as much as we like. So we add some rows and some columns, and I define them with there's various different ways you can define it. You can use any width sort of measurement. So I'm using pixels here for the first element, but we could use ems or percentages or whatever we want to. Yeah. But what's cool with this is this idea of, I guess, the flexibility of the grid. Because if you think about laying out websites, some of it is, we know they're fixed sizes. Some of it is in reference to other things on the page, and some of it's just we want to fill whatever's left.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying here in this example is the first row should be 100 pixels high. So that's always defined.
Yep.
And then the next row should be as big as it needs to be to fit the content.
Okay.
And then the next row is going to fill whatever space is left up after all of the other calculations have done. Yeah. And I can put one fractal, I can put another row in here, which is another fractal. So that would say, okay, there's two fractals. Yeah. So that's 50% of the remaining space is going to be for this column, and 50% is going to be for that column. Or I could say two fractals. And so that would be like
2/3 and 1/3.
Precisely, of the remaining space after all the other calculations. Yeah. I just want one fractal here. And then the last column.
So that would be 100% of the remaining space.
That will be whatever's left over after the 100 pixels and the min content of the other two.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
So this is going to be kind of my really flexible row.
Yeah.
The other two are going to be determined by whatever I put in them.
Yeah.
The minimum content size.
Yeah.
And then this one's going to be like expanding or decrepting to fill the rest of the space.
Nice. Okay.
And then the bottom one's going to be min content. So I've defined my rows.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to define my columns across. Now I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm going to have on the left-hand side 300 pixels. Then I'm going to have one fractal, which is like the remaining space. And then another 300 pixel on the side. So now I've created my little grid. And you can be as complicated as you like with this stuff.
Okay.
You can have as many columns and rows as you like. If you have a repeating column pattern or repeating row pattern, there's syntax for describing repeating things and
stuff.
as well.
You've bound this to the body, but presumably you can put this to
any
a div or any element.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Makes sense.
I've said that there's a gap, a grid row gap of 10 pixels and a grid column gap of 10 pixels as well.
Okay.
That just means a bit like the space between the different columns or the rows is going to be. I don't know why I'm using a different word to describe. I think everyone knows what a gap is, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The gap between the columns and the rows is going to be 10 pixels. Yeah. That's actually not the external. So the grid won't get a 10 pixel element around it. It's just going to be the in-between bits. Yeah, not the border. This is the in-between bits between columns and rows.
Okay.
And I'm just setting the body to be 100%, just so it fills the whole screen. And I'm just arbitrarily putting margins and paddings to 0 just for the point. Just for
fun.
Giggles, yeah. So now, if we add in some CSS,
amazing.
It is pretty amazing, isn't it? Now, I'm referencing these not by CSS class names, but just by the actual element, because I've only got one element on the page, so it keeps it nice and simple. So I've got my H1, my article, my nav, my aside, my footer.
Okay.
And what I'm doing is I'm assigning them positions.
Okay.
So I'm saying this H1 should go in row 1, and it should be in column 2, and it should span 2 elements.
Got it. So this is kind of, you can see the sort of heritage of the Windows app approach, because this is a bit like what you do in XAML. You kind of have to do that kind of thing in XAML as well.
This system derived from a Microsoft engineer who was looking at what you could achieve in XAML and saying, actually, wouldn't it be great if we could do this on the web too? Yeah. This is actually, over time, some of it's similar to the old grid specification, some of it's not the same.
Yeah.
But this is roughly what you could do with the old thing as well. So this works down to IE10 if you want to.
Okay.
Although I wouldn't recommend using the old grid system, just use the new one. And then we're saying align self, which is center, and justify self, which is start.
Okay.
You'll see start, end, and center being like the way of describing. It's a bit like left, right, center.
Yeah.
But basically, this H1 is now vertically and horizontally aligned, which is, if you know,
that's incredibly difficult to do, isn't it? I mean, that's one of those things that's like always frustrating trying to do that.
It's like, why is this so hard? Yeah. It's no longer very hard at all. Yeah. We're just saying that this is center aligned, and it would be straightforward to vertically and center align this with these 2 parameters.
I can hear developers all around the land now going, whoop!
Yeah. Whoop! Yeah. I can't quite use it necessarily in production just yet, but it's sort of like in a world just 3 years away, or maybe even 2 years away, because browsers are much more evergreen nowadays. This will be just totally usable everywhere. But
totally cool.
And then when we say article, that's on grid, that's on row 2, and I want it to span 2 rows.
Yep.
And grid column, it's on grid column 2. And I go down and I just basically assign nav to row 2, column 1, aside to column 3, and then the footer I'm putting down on the 4th row, and I'm saying, rather than span, I'm actually saying the column start, which is 1, and I'm saying go to column 4.
Okay. Yeah.
So it ends at column 4, and to center align anything inside of that, and also stretch the element to fill the entire grid element.
Right.
I'm also adding a background color to that one and giving a padding. So
conceptually, it's quite easy to sort of, because everyone understands how a table is laid out, or a spreadsheet, or this idea of rows and columns. It's quite conceptually easy to.
It is,
figure out how that's going to look.
And so if I go into this one and open with Chrome.
Okay.
You can see I have got my H1, which is at the top, and if you remember, we had down here we had a one column, which was 300 pixels, I believe.
Yeah.
Then one fractal, which fills the rest of it, and then another 300 pixel area.
So what happens if you do the whole slidey resizing the browser thing?
Well, at the moment, what will happen is it won't look very good, but we'll look at that in a moment.
Okay.
Because we've obviously got a 300 still, 300, but the middle bit is contracting and sizing.
Yeah.
Now, I did say that the H1, it's on row 1, and it spans 2 columns.
Yeah.
So you'll see that it's spanning not only this piece, but it's also spanning the 300
Yeah.
pixel version
Yeah.
thing there as well. And then at the bottom, you'll see my footer,
Yeah.
which is stretched. It spans all of the columns. It's on the final row, and it spans all of them. It's a bit of a bug there. Never mind. I'll look at that later. But you see, you've got the left column, the right column, the centerpiece, the header, and the footer,
Yeah.
kind of as you would expect it to be
Yeah.
laid out. Now, if we look at the same thing in Firefox, Firefox actually gives us a little bit of a visual clue. If we go into the DevTools, where are DevTools? Oh, it's just my developer, and I choose Inspector, and I just inspect an element there. You'll see on their CSS sort of viewer,
Yeah.
you get this like waffle kind of grid. Well, it looks like a grid thing.
Yeah.
If you click that, it switches the grid on.
I love how you use it, making up words to describe things here.
I know, it's much easier to say grid.
We're talking about grids, and it's a picture of a grid. But you just
I chose waffle actually because a tutorial by Eric Meyer, which is from 2004, told me about this feature, and he described it as a waffle.
Yeah.
And I then passed on.
Fine,
It does look more like a waffle.
It's merely an observation.
Yeah.
But good.
But you can see that the grid is kind of you can see how the grid is laid out.
Yeah, it's a
and
neat
how it's
feature
working.
to be able to do that. Yeah.
But we placed these elements. It didn't matter where they were laid out and the order they were laid out. We decided where they go. There actually is an automatic layout feature. So if there is a way of there's an algorithm which figures out what elements should go where. If you don't describe what parts of what element, it will just basically pick up the next element and put it in the next row or column.
Yeah.
But that's probably not. Most people won't be probably using it like that. You might be using it, I guess, if you're actually creating some kind of data layout where you don't necessarily know how many columns or how many rows you've got.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, you're going to be I would say you'd probably be specifying where the element goes on the grid. So at the moment, if we did make this browser a little bit smaller, we've got this problem where that middle piece is just getting smaller and they're staying 300 pixels, but that's probably not what we want to do. But of course, it's CSS, so we can use it in conjunction with a style sheet.
Okay.
A media query, sorry.
Okay.
So if I just go in here and I would say this one,
Okay.
I am going to place I've just said anything lower than 992 pixels. It redefines the grid.
Okay.
So now I can say on my rows, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows now.
Yeah.
And I've got just one column.
Right.
So 5 rows, one column, and I'm basically going to put all of the different things in a vertical layout effectively. So now, if I go into this and refresh, you'll see now it's vertically aligned.
I see, yeah. Okay.
And you'll see that I've got my H1, I've got my document. I'm going to just close this down a bit. The document, some stuff, and then I've got my aside, and then I've got my nav, and then I've got my footer at the bottom.
Okay.
And then just changing something around. So maybe I want to put the aside at the top. Before the article, well, I could go, okay, that one's now 2, and that one's now 3. And if we go back in here now, the aside should be above the article.
Yeah.
And it's all just CSS. So with depending on the screen which is viewing it and the media queries that we're using, we could relay things out. It's very easy to relay out things for sort of print layout, for different screen resolutions, different screen sizes, and all that sort of stuff. And traditionally, if you're using Bootstrap to do a grid system, what tends to happen is when you get a mobile view, we just go down to a single column layout like we've got here, because it's just the easiest thing to do. But I think this will open up the opportunity and possibility that we could do more complicated kind of things. So maybe if I wanted the aside, I wanted to do, even on a mobile view, I wanted to do maybe like a dual column thing. I could do that. So we could go in here and I'm just going to take this media query out and put another one in. And this does the same sort of thing, but in my grid here, now I've just added 100% section on the side. And I've said the H1 should span 2 columns. The article should be on the second row, but just in column 1.
Okay.
The nav should be on row 4, and it should span 2 columns. And the aside should be on row 2 and in column 2. So now the aside is going to be next to the article.
Yeah.
And then the footer should be on the 5th row, and it should span the entire thing as well. And if we go back up and click in, I'm not saying this is a beautiful layout or anything like that,
No,
but
you get the idea there.
you get the idea that it's no longer going to be the case that mobile views have to be just single views or single, because it's easier to achieve in CSS.
Sure.
We can start creating much more complicated layouts potentially for mobile, which I think is a really powerful thing. So CSS Grid, it's in the majority of evergreen browsers. It's in Chrome. It's in Firefox at the moment. In the main releases, not just their nightlies. It's in our current nightly version.
In
In
Edge.
Edge, in the preview version, but it's not currently in full fat Edge. But it will be very shortly.
Yeah.
And Safari doesn't support it yet, but I think it's definitely something which is going to be across all of the browsers very shortly. So in a year, 2 years' time, you'll be able to use CSS Grid with confidence that it's going to be like 95% of the browsers going to support it. Okay, so that's all of CSS Grid today.
Thank you very much.
Next week, we're going to be looking at Visual Studio for web developers.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of cool features with Visual Studio for web devs.
So a little bit like when we looked at VS Code, we're going to look at Visual Studio and see
Visual Studio, and we're going to look at Surface Dial as well, which would be quite cool.
Oh, I've never seen one.
You can use a Surface Dial with Visual Studio.
I did not know.
Where you'll find.
How much does a Surface Dial cost?
I think they're about £99 in the UK.
Oh, does that mean I can expense one of those for the X episode?
Do it.
I'm doing that. Yeah. So to my boss, you can expect a £99 expense for a Surface Dial, and we'll see you next week.